Greetings and salutations, friends! It is time we talk a little bit about Total War Warhammer 2. Now, as many of you might have noticed, I haven't really been covering it as much as I did 1, and part of that is because I was feeling a bit dejected, honestly, because I was kind of disappointed by the fact that they did precisely what I was afraid of them doing, which was releasing Total War Warhammer 2, or at least planning to release it, not out yet, to release Total War Warhammer 2 as a standalone game, in my opinion, purely to slap a $60 price tag on it. But I figured we would be talking a little bit about that today, as it seems like a good time to have a talk about what should and should not be considered a full game. As we all know, gaming and game series both change over time, evolving or indeed devolving as time goes past, and perhaps most importantly, as the audience's tolerance for bullshit waxes and wanes. Since I am mostly a Total War kind of guy, and, well, Warhammer is upcoming and relevant, we'll be using that series as an example. Let us start with Empire. In the case of Empire Total War, pre-ordering the game would give you a copy of Rome Total War Gold Edition and some special units. That's a pretty damn good incentive. Rome Total War was a fantastic game, and for free, plus a little bit of extra, eye candy units, etc., that is a damn good incentive, and probably pre-order the way I think it should be done. Free game in the series, and a little bit of eye candy. Fantastic. In Shogun 2, there was a couple pre-order incentives. If you bought the game at GameStop, you would get the historic Battle of Kawagui or something. Whilst if you got it at Best Buy, you would get an additional 1,000 koku at the start of the game, the in-game currency. Pretty fucking shitty stuff, in other words. But then there was the digital version. Most digital retailers simply made it so that the pre-ordering would give you the limited edition version, which amongst other things gave you access to the Hattori faction, which was later made available as paid DLC. Now, the whole thing about dividing up pre-orders between various retailers is absolute cancer, and I'm very happy that Creative Assembly have stepped away from that bullshit because it is shit. But furthermore, about the Hattori faction DLC. At the time, no one really lifted an eyebrow at that. In Shogun 2, pretty much all the factions were more or less identical to begin with. You played the green Japanese with a slight bonus to katana infantry, or you played the yellow Japanese with a bonus to yari infantry. Not exactly a big deal. It was, however, a sign of things to come, a canary down the coal mine, if you will. And then comes Rome 2. That game's pre-order incentive was not 1, not 2, but 3 full factions cut from the base game: Athens, Epirus, and Sparta, in the guise of a culture pack. Now that is a pretty fucking major cut, and some pretty damn huge factions as well. Athens and Sparta are pretty damn important to a Rome Total War game. This culture pack also of course included all of their units, buildings and special rules, etc., all of which was implemented and fully functional in the game, but hid behind an arbitrary paywall. And this most definitively got a reaction from the audience. A good old-fashioned outrage and, in my opinion, justified anger. However, that anger was utterly overshadowed by the explosion of discontent that followed the release of the game itself. On release, Rome 2 was a disaster, and the pre-order controversy was drowned out by the simple fact that the game itself was a solid year away from being released. And on top of that, Creative Assembly decided to heap insult on top of injury by refusing the early reports that anything was wrong, giving us platitudes and telling us that no, there must be something wrong on your end. It was an absolute shit show of the kind of proportions we only see once a decade, and it completely overshadowed the whole cut content controversy. And on that note, let's quickly go over what I define as cut content, because there's a lot of apologia going around about that stuff. Basically, anything that is finished and fully ready and or implemented in the game at the game's release date, but is not included in the base game, is cut content. For example, in the case of Total War Warhammer 1, where they cut out the Chaos Warrior race pack. This race was fully functional and implemented in the game as an AI faction, but was locked behind a paywall. They were fully functioning, they were fully implemented, they were in-game, everything was right there. All it really needed was a single change of code telling the game that you paid for the extra privilege of an item that was fully in the game on day one. That is what I consider cut content, and that is bullshit. And this time, the outcry was huge. The failure that was Rome 2 was fresh in everyone's mind, and no one was ready to take any more shit sitting down. As a response to this, CA/Sega announced that the race pack would be included with the base game for anyone who purchased the game within a certain time after release. An alright but far from perfect compromise. They also announced that they might look into their pre-order practices. And now we have Total War 2 pre-order bonus being a faction for Total War Warhammer 1, which is more comparable to giving you Rome Total War Gold Edition for free. Not as good, but close, and something that I consider to be perfectly okay. And again, I remind you, there was a lot of backtracking over at Sega after this. There was a lot of apologies issues, there was a lot of vague words that we listen to the community, we take your feedback seriously. The usual stuff that tells us that our outrage has achieved something. And make absolutely no mistake, it was our outrage that achieved that. No questions about it. Creative Assembly and or Sega would not have changed their plans without it. Do not question that for the merest moment. It is always important to remember that Creative Assembly and Sega are companies. They are not your friends. They will not work in your best interest. They will work for their own best interest, and you might argue that that was not always the case, and indeed, I would kind of agree. A couple of decades ago, I might even think that, yeah, game companies, by and large, were actually creating products out of a certain degree of passion and for an audience, but, well, that time is long since gone in anything but the indie scene, I am afraid. And the final moral of this story is that a games company will pretty much always try to test the consumer's patience, trying to screw you just a little bit harder each and every time until the backlash finally hits, and then almost without exception, they will scurry back in retreat and offer up the usual pleasantries. We listen to the community. The community is precious, good fans, kind, gentle fans. Don't hurt Gollum. You know, the usual. We've all pretty much seen it, and if you're a Total War fan, oh, you have definitely seen it time and time again. And this good old cycle is precisely what we're seeing once again with the whole Total War 2 is a sequel nonsense. Once again, Attilla was the canary down the coal mine. The game was basically expansion level content, the same level of stuff we had seen before with Fall of the Samurai and Medieval 2's fantastic Kingdoms expansion. But despite that, we were told that Attilla was not an expansion. It was a brand new Total War game, which everyone called bullshit on, but it was priced at a relatively reasonable level of $45, a bit more expensive than Fall of the Samurai and Kingdoms, both of which in my opinion added more to the original game, but it was an entirely new setting, it had a bunch of new units, and it looked cool and different, and this was the first time this was really done, a test run if you will, and most of us let it slip by as okay. Now, by the way, I'd like to point out, Napoleon also did this as a standalone, but I genuinely do believe that that was far more of a apology move than Attilla was, and this is in fact one of the reasons why a lot of people viewed Attilla as well, as an apology move, but I don't think it could really be compared to that. Napoleon in my opinion, was released as a standalone because they realized that even just trying to hitch that game to Empire was just not gonna work. And again, it was priced far more reasonably. It presented us with an entirely new time zone, entirely new units, and a lot of new material. Napoleon Total War was also, in my opinion, a better proposition than Attila was. But hey, let's move on. Because now we have the main thrust, the main offensive. Total War Warhammer 2. $60, full AAA price for a sequel released a little over a year after the first game. This sequel will add in 4 factions, a new map, and a couple of new mechanics. Compare that to Kingdoms, which cost around $35 and added in 4 new campaigns, each with its own map mechanics and themes, along with over a dozen new factions with all of their unique army lists and mechanics, over 100 new units, 50 buildings, etc, etc, etc. And of course, on top of that, Medieval 2 was in many ways a considerably more complex game than Total War Warhammer is. Of course, you can bring up the argument that the races in Warhammer are more diverse and interesting, and you would be entirely correct. They also would require more work individually. The different races are by far the game's strongest point, but I would argue that the factions in Kingdoms were pretty dang diverse too, both in terms of looks, mechanics, and army rosters. For example, the Teutonic Knights played very differently to the surrounding heathens. Their recruitment, for example, was based on religious influence in the area, and they might be saddled with a bunch of European war tourists from time to time. The campaign in the Americas was also very, very unique, with the natives desperately trying to hold off the invading hordes of Europeans. The native would have a considerable numerical advantage, but they would of course also be technologically inferior. And so on and so on. The 4 campaigns were very different, played different, had very different units, very different settings, and very different mechanics. I would personally have no problem whatsoever saying that Kingdoms is by far the best piece of content ever developed by Creative Assembly, and so far, bearing in mind that I haven't played Total War 2 yet, Kingdoms looks to be, at the very least, equal to it, and in many ways, for example price and mechanics, to be a flat-out better game. I mean, again, let's look at what Total War Warhammer 2 really offers, shall we? At the very least, what we know so far. We have 4 factions, which is nice, and they are hopefully quite diverse, but Kingdoms had a lot more, and they again were also pretty damn diverse. What else do we have in Total War Warhammer 2? We have the addition of what is essentially bridge battles, which we used to have in older Total War games anyways. We have rogue armies, which again is kind of like the old bandit and rogue armies we used to have, but at least this time they are supposedly unique armies, so alright. We get a new map, hopefully with some new mechanics, and indeed we do know that there will be some new faction mechanics, but again, well, Kingdoms had 4 new maps, and again, with different mechanics. It is quite possible that the Total War Warhammer 2 map will be bigger, possibly, but will it be as diverse? Well, we will have to wait and see. What else? A new victory condition? Alright, cool. What else? Are we getting universal sync kills back? I would be happy to pay for that, but no word on that as of yet. Are we getting improved siege battles? Because God Emperor knows we need that. That is by far the biggest failing of Total War Warhammer. The siege battles are atrocious. In fact, I would go so far as to say that Shogun 1 had equally good siege battles, which is fucking sad, but no words on that yet. How about new multiplayer stuff? I mean, Shogun 2 had amazing multiplayer, yet it completely disappeared after Shogun 2. And considering the fact that they don't have to work on the engine, they have way less work to do to produce Total War Warhammer 2, this, in my opinion, should be a really, really important feature. Again, we don't have any word on that yet, but of course the marketing machine has not run its course, so maybe? Fingers crossed. And we get some new legendary lords and some new mechanics that lets armies use special spells, basically when in certain positions on the map. Okay, that sounds pretty alright for an expansion, but is that really full game content? It's all pretty much small tweaks, upgrades, and new takes on already existing mechanics. Now, perhaps the 4 factions will be super different. For example, the Skaven might work nothing like a Horde faction and have a completely new mechanic that's completely different from the underground move we see in the old world. They might be a super new and super interesting faction, and I really, really hope so. For example, I still hope to see my idea of units having disposable meat shield implemented, for example, but if not, I have a hard time seeing how this is sufficiently different to be worth the pretty damn massive price tag. Basically, we're gonna have to see the armies being vastly different from what we already had in Total War Warhammer 1, but I'm wondering just how much they can really change. I'm not talking about the addition of a couple new mechanics here, like, for example, Norska, which has a new and really cool mechanic where you can raise the settlement to gain favor with various gods. That's really cool, but I'm gonna have to see something considerably more than that to really consider these factions to be super new and super interesting. I'm just kind of wondering how many more ways we can play Total War Warhammer. How many more ways can we really change the base gameplay? Because Total War Warhammer 1 did that, compared to all the Total War games, with the addition of magics, monstrous units, and stuff like that, but well, we are still working with pretty much the same template here, so I'm not entirely sure. I'm hoping that Creative Assembly will be able to impress me and surprise me on that, but, well, I have my suspicions that what we are going to be seeing is going to be expansion-level content, but it is most certainly not priced accordingly. Now, we could of course argue about the definition of an expansion, but honestly I think that would be rather pointless, as at the end of the day, it is a purely subjective value proposition. How much are you personally willing to pay for what is on offer? For example, I think that realistically speaking, considering the variety of factions, mechanics, and models that CA are perfectly justified for asking up to $18 for their faction DLC. Granted, I would much prefer if they dropped the thrice damned mini campaigns, and indeed they kind of are certain to do that, and make them an optional purchase, since I at least consider them to be a near worthless price padding, but oh well. For me personally, it comes down to the lump sum in many cases. For example, I might point out that in this new sequel, you get 4 races for $60, so $15 per race, plus the map, etc. That is a great deal right there. After all, Arch, you just said that $18 was okay for a single faction. The difference here is that in the case of the individual DLC, you are never forced to get it. If you don't want to play the Beastmen, you can just not purchase them. In the case of the sequel, you're not asked for $15 or $18, you're asked for $16. 16 plus, by the way, for many of us here in Europe, with no choice to pick and choose the factions you want. I would therefore argue that being allowed to pick the one you want for a higher individual cost is a better value proposition than a bunch of races that you might not want for a lower individual cost, but almost 4 times the total cost. Personally, I would have loved to see the option to buy the new map and settings plus 1 race of your choice for, say, $25, and then the possibility to get the other races as standalone DLC. And then, of course, the option to buy them all as a pack for $60. I would have loved to see that. I would have considered that to be a very consumer-friendly thing to do. At the end of the day, however, it is up to the individual to make up his own mind on these things. In my mind, since there has been previous expansion level content that adds as much, or indeed more, I consider this to be expansion level content, and therefore not worth the $60 price tag. In my opinion, they are simply just calling this a new Total War game, Total War Warhammer 2, purely to drive up the price. I do not think it is justified with the content within it, and I think it is an extremely cynical and assholey move. I do not, however, think there is going to be a huge outcry over this. Not yet. Total War Warhammer 1 was a good game, and as such there isn't any real anger in the community at the moment, or at the very least not in the Total War Warhammer 1 community and the community as a whole. Granted, there has been a lot of anger from the historical community, and Creative Assembly has been throwing out stuff and tidbits there quite rapidly to try to appease them, but I think that the hardcore historical community is such a relatively small portion of the overall community, and the fact, of course, that they're not being angry because they're being asked to pay $60 for this game, so I don't think that is really going to cause any change. And as such, most people will simply choose to let this one slip, hoping that it will be a one-time occurrence, and not bleed over to the historical games, for example, and make selling expansions for $60 the new norm. We are going to have to wait and see, but if the industry as a whole is any indication, and if CA's previous actions are any indications, well, I would not be at all surprised if the wheel keeps turning. Anyways, until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.